Welcome everyone to AURI Connect's Webinar Wednesday, part of AURI Connect's monthly online series featuring updates on the work that AURI is doing to foster long-term economic benefit for Minnesota through value-added agricultural products. I'm Dan Scogan, the AURI Director of Government and Industry Relations and your host on Webinar Wednesday. The AURI Connects program is hosted by the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute in Minnesota. This program aims to actively engage all participants in the food and ag industry to improve competitiveness of producers, businesses, and entrepreneurs through ongoing purposeful connection of resources and partners along the value chain, and increase knowledge of opportunities, technologies, and trends. Remember, this event is being recorded and archived and can be found at auri.org. Remember that you will be muted during our presentations, but you can send us your written questions through the Q&A portal on your screen. Today, we have brought together a panel to discuss the value of cultivated wild rice in our diets and in our agricultural communities. We will hear from 4 presenters today, including Beth Nelson, the president of the Minnesota Cultivated Wild Rice Council, Peter Eimel, a second-generation wild rice grower. His father started their farm in 1972 as a wild rice operation. They have since expanded to include seed potatoes, soybeans, and peas. His educational background includes a BA in biology from Carleton College and an MS in applied plant science specializing in plant genetics from the University of Minnesota. Also joining us today, Julie Raw, the manager of Gourmet House Division of Riviana Foods. Riviana Foods Incorporated is North America's largest processor, marketer, and distributor of branded and private label rice products through its family of well-known brands, including Minute, Mahatma, Success, Carolina, Comet, Adolphus, Blue Ribbon, Rice Select, Gourmet House, and Tilda. And also joining us is Lali Okino, senior scientist of food and nutrition, and leads the food program area for AURI. She conducts and manages applied research and technical assistance for food clients and works with the project team to facilitate the successful execution and development of new products, projects, and initiatives. Well, we're going to start today with Beth. So Beth Nelson, welcome to Webinar Wednesday.
Thanks, Dan. We are honored to be here today to talk about Minnesota's state grain. And it's the only cereal grain native to North America. Wild rice. In 1981, the Minnesota Cultivated Wild Rice Council and several tribes asked the Minnesota legislature to enact a wild rice labeling law. And what that labeling law does is inform the consumer of what they're buying. The place of origin, Minnesota, California, or Canada generally, whether it's cultivated or lake wild rice, and if the lake wild rice has been machine harvested. In Minnesota, you can find Minnesota and California cultivated wild rice, Minnesota lake wild rice, which by law in the state of Minnesota must be harvested in a non-motorized canoe or boat with some sort of wooden flail like in this picture. You can also sometimes find Canadian wild rice, which is lake wild rice, but most often has been machine harvested as shown here. Minnesota lake wild rice commands a higher price in the marketplace since it is very labor intensive. While you can find hand-harvested wild rice, it is often mechanically parched. However, if you're fortunate enough to find Minnesota lake rice that has also been hand-parched, you're finding a very special product that commands an even higher price due to its extremely labor-intensive process. It is done much like it has been for thousands of years. The green wild rice is roasted or parched over an open fire. Then it is thrashed by dancing on the wild rice to remove the hulls, sometimes called jigging. And then it is placed in a basket to separate the hulls from the grains by tossing it in the air, allowing the wind to blow away the hulls, leaving the kernels in the basket. Wild rice has played an important role in Native American spiritual and cultural practices for thousands of years, and it was one of the first items traded by them with the French explorers. It was the explorers who named wild rice. The Native Americans call it minomen, which means good berry or good seed, and the explorers called it riz sauvage, because it looked like a wild and crazy version of the white rice plants they were used to seeing back home. Wild rice is coveted by both the Minnesota cultivated and hand-harvested communities. And in 2007, we collaborated together in requesting funding from the Minnesota legislature for a DNR study on the threats to the native populations of wild rice. While the study was completed in 2008, the threats are still the same today. Hydrological changes, recreational water use, shoreland development, invasive species, lack of recruitment and retention of harvesters, and the others that you can see listed here. I'd like to also point out that the study found that the traditional wild rice breeding program for the cultivated industry does not pose a threat to native stands. In fact, about the time the study was being done, both lake and cultivated wild rice experienced a bumper year, indicating they can peacefully coexist. There is a recent economic impact study that shows the Minnesota cultivated wild rice industry contributes $58.4 million and 641 jobs to the state's economy, providing much needed income to some of the poorest counties in the state. I'd like to also point out that Red Lake Reservation owns and operates the 5th largest cultivated wild rice farm in the state, and we're proud to have them as a member of our council. There's a recent UK publication touting wild rice as an upcoming superfood. Let's take a look. Wild rice is GMO free. There is no genetically engineered wild rice anywhere in the world. It is considered an ancient grain, which is still trending today. It offers 30 of the 48 grams of whole grains recommended daily. It is gluten-free, rich in antioxidants, and its protein quality is very good for a plant protein. It contains all 9 of the essential amino acids, although you will hear in just a bit that we are slightly low in lysine. And it is also a good meat extender and good for vegan or flexitarian diets. It's low in calories, having 33% fewer calories than brown rice. And it's nutrient dense, low in calories, fat, and carbohydrates, but high in protein, fiber, and essential minerals and vitamins. Wild rice also fits nicely on FDA's My Plate guide, being a whole grain, but it also provides protein and antioxidants. So now I'll turn it over to Peter Eimel, a cultivated wild rice farmer and chair of our council.
Thanks, Beth. A little history on our operation. My dad started with a partner in the fall of 1971. He didn't grow up on a farm, but was intrigued by the idea of cultivating wild rice. So they built the infrastructure and started with that original 40 acres of wild rice, with the first crop coming in 1972. Since that time, we've expanded our operation to a little over 5,000 tillable acres with 4 full-time and 12 seasonal employees outside of family members. So the first patties that were put into production were in the Brainerd area by the Godward family in the 1950s. As a testament to the longevity of a lot of the producers, the Godward family is still producing to this day. That original patty expanded into the 10 to 18,000 acres that are currently in production in Minnesota in any given year. In the 1980s, that expansion, California began producing as well. Since that time, Minnesota is now the world's largest wild rice producer, but the important portion of this slide would show you that in 2021, we produced about 13.5 million pounds in the United States. And as far as utilization for new product development and the investments that are needed for that, what most people find the biggest issue is whether there's product availability going forward. And if you look back at 2016, we were producing over 24 million pounds at that time. So there is room for expansion in the industry. As I mentioned, with the Godward family being involved in the wild rice business for over 70 years, the commitment of the growers is substantial, not only because of their interest in the crop, but because of the capital intensive nature of growing wild rice. You've got land costs, you've got ground that needs to be tiled. There's a land development component that I'll get into in a minute. There's significant equipment modification that needs to be done to deal with the crop. If I were growing 2,000 or 2,500 acres of wheat or soybeans or corn, I'd have 1, maybe 2 combines. In order to do the kind of job that I need to do on a little over 2,000 acres of wild rice, I need to maintain 6 combines. There's no formal seed industry for wild rice. Variety development's done by the research team at the University of Minnesota. The seed expansion and the sales are facilitated through the Wild Rice Research and Promotion Council, but it's handled on farm with those expansions done and operated by the farmers themselves and supervised by Minnesota Crop Improvement. Along with that, a lot of the pathology and agronomy research is done on farm, again, because of the infrastructure that's needed to do these things. The small plot work is done at the Research and Outreach Center, again, by the University of Minnesota research team, but there's no intermediary there. So then we go immediately on farm to combine and field scale research. One topic that always comes up when we're talking about agriculture in this era is sustainability. A lot of definitions for that. There's one here. We're constantly evaluating both operationally and within our ecosystem of each of our farms, how we're impacting what's going on farm and in our immediate area. There's a variety of different ways to do that, but outside groups like the University of Minnesota and some others have done on-farm studies looking at how we're interacting with that ecosystem around us, and it's certainly something we're cognizant of all the time. Operationally, to evaluate that, we're constantly monitoring everything we're doing on farm. We're looking at our land base extensively all the time. That tile and land leveling comes in as a big component of that. That minimizes our water use. We're rotating with complementary crops, potatoes, soybeans, peas, in our case. That's allowed us to develop an integrated pest and fertilizer management plan. So when we're growing a legume like soybeans, we're putting a lot of nitrogen back into our soil. That helps us minimize our synthetic nitrogen use on our wild rice production that follows. Wild rice is 6, 7, 8 feet tall, so you've got a lot of material that stays in the field after harvest. So in order to maintain our soil organic matter, we're utilizing vertical and minimum tillage aspects in order to maintain that organic matter, because that's really what's providing a lot of our micronutrient base, and then also acting as a sponge for our moisture for our potato operation. In order to categorize this all the time and evaluate it, we do an extensive amount of soil sampling to monitor that nutrient base and monitor that soil organic matter. We're constantly looking at more effective and efficient delivery technologies for everything that we're putting on farm. Coated nitrogen is a great product that's been helping us spoon feed our potato operation. And we do a lot of scouting to not only minimize pesticide application, but also maximize that efficacy when it's necessary. The water we're using, which I talked about earlier with land leveling, we use electric pumps, and we pump all surface water. We don't use groundwater. It's gravity fed out into our system. We control that water depth and minimize its usage, again, by the land leveling. And the pattern tiling that we do to a single outlet helps make that efficient, effective, and also minimizes silt release. But the real important thing about our water usage is that in general, the vast majority of the time, we're pumping water in high flow conditions, and we're releasing it back into the watershed at low flow conditions during the course of the summer. We're located, our drainage basin is the Red River Valley. A lot of flooding there historically. And west of where I'm located, they've spent a lot of time and effort putting in retention ponds to do that exact same thing, capture the water in the high flow situations and release it in low flow. And we're able to do that also, but while maintaining the productivity of our land base. So if you're going to look at sustainability within the operation, you also have to have traceability. So for us, that requires electronic logging of all of our inputs and all of our field events. Anytime anything's applied or anytime we make a pass over the field, tillage or otherwise, we track all that and we can report all that. That information's reconciled back to vendor invoices. What you'd see to your right there is a traditional looking yield map. We use that for a lot of our agronomic decisions, but that also provides me with a date, time, and GPS log of where that product was collected at what time. I can trace that back to which truck it was put into and the unique ID for each one of those loads. And that allows me to trace that all the way to the end user, which I think is a great start for Julie.
Thank you, Peter. I'm here to share with you a little bit about the processing and manufacturing. The wild rice facility of Riviana Foods is located in Clearbrook, Minnesota, right in the center of one of the largest growing regions for wild rice, of which 55 to 60% of the acres are within about a 25-mile radius of this facility. A little background about the company. We were owned by the growers back in the 80s. We were just a processing facility with the packaging being done down in Grand Rapids. Moving into 86, the facility was purchased by Anheuser-Busch, continued as a processing facility at that time. In 1991, the manufacturing and packaging was moved up to Clearbrook. At that time, we were a farm-to-fork operation. In 94, admin and sales moved up into Clearbrook, and now we were all under one roof. In 99, we were purchased by Riviana Foods, and at that time opened up an opportunity of a lot of value-added products. In 2004, Riviana was purchased by Abro Foods, which is a wholly subsidiary leading Spanish food company and the world leader in the rice sector. We do have 23 permanent employees here, and we are a packaging and manufacturing facilities with certifications of SQF, which is a globally recognized FSMA, allowing us to market worldwide. We are also gluten-free certified together with organic certified. Next. In the beginning, the operation was run manually, receiving it, separating it, curing it in rows, parching it by batch, 800-pound batch processes. Next, Beth. Moving into current, we are situated with 62,000 square feet on a 10-acre with 26,000 square foot of warehousing and 168,000 bushel of bin storage. We have a continuous processing, parboiling, a milling, instantizing, together with 2 industrial ingredient bulk and blending packaging lines here in Clearbrook. Just a snapshot overview, you can see the capacity bin together with processing, main facility, and outside storage. 6 acres of asphalt is where the curing process begins. So today we receive the rice into Clearbrook directly from the farm. It's weighed, stored in day lots until it's ready for parboiling. Clearbrook has received up to 2 million pounds in one 8-hour single shift. The day lots are delivered in, deep piled, and cured for approximately 6 to 8 days. You can see as it comes in, it's real green, and then as it cures, it starts to turn in color to a brownish color. In 2013, we added a yard extension by adding a bagging system because of the yield increase between the growers over the years. We were needing to extend the yard storage, so we added a bagging system. So we went from deep piling to bagging. In 2005, you can see our continuous parboil system. After it's cured in the yard, at a 32% moisture, it's brought in through a parboil process, which is a steaming process to gelatinize the inner kernel, and then a 3-step drying process prior to milling. After it's been milled, we will store it in these bins in a stable form. It's at about a 10 to 11% moisture until further cleaning is done after harvest. So this process goes between mid-August through the beginning of October. Now we move into our cleaning process. After we do a final milling, basically a hull removal, then we bring it through and we grade it and we do a cleaning. We grade it out by different grades offering different cook times. A grade being 40-minute, you'll typically see that product in your retail or your food service. B grade is going to be a product that is roughly 40 minutes and it's going to be blended with brown rice. C grade is going to be a 25-minute cook that's going to be blended with white rice. Brokens is a byproduct of milling. And then scarification is you take a product and you scarify the outer bran to allow water to penetrate through quicker, allowing it to cook up in 20 minutes, for example. Once the product is clean, we store it in super sacks of 2,000 pounds until it's going to go to further packaging, whether it's going to be blended or instantized. This is your typical storage. We take it into one of our packaging lines, bulk blending. We're going to blend product, whether it's straight wild or we're going to blend it with white rices or brown rices. And then it's going to be packed off in 25, 50, or super sacks to market. Our instant value added line, we're going to take a typical A-grade 60-minute cook and we're going to cook it and bring it down to a 5-minute application for microwavable stovetop stuffing types. Typical pack here would be 50-pound bag or 1,200-pound tote bags. Then we'll take, here's our value added facilities located in Memphis. This operation began in 2010, where we pack off our pure product of wild rice, and then they'll take a typical A grade and they'll IQF it, they'll cook it, and they'll individually freeze it for frozen entrees as an ingredient, or they'll take and they'll cook it, retort it in a stand-up pouch or microwavable cup. The distribution network for LTL, you can see we've got 5 distribution warehouses throughout the US. This will be for your typical less than truckload quantities going to retail or food service, truckload quantities as well across the US. The export markets for the wild rice, you can see in the red bullet points, we're in 11 countries in Asia, 18 countries in the EU, 5 countries in North America, 3 countries in the Oceania, and 6 countries in South America. This would be pretty much the conclusion, and turn it over to Beth.
All right, well, thanks, Pete and Julie. And now we'd like to highlight a few research projects that we've collaborated with AURI on over the years. An antioxidant project showed that there is high potential for commercial applications in food systems, especially meat products. So we took another look at wild rice ground beef mixtures and found that when compared to 100% ground beef, the mixtures contain less fat, protein, and cholesterol. They scored higher in taste panel evaluations, and they became less rancid during frozen storage. Another project showed potential for instant quick freeze wild rice, which we just heard Julie talk about their IQF line. And then our most recent study completed last month looked at the protein quality and gut microbiome and found that protein quality of wild rice is very good for a plant protein, and its protein is highly digestible. In a previous rat study, the same researchers had found that feeding rats actually lowered liver cholesterol. And then in this new study, they found it also lowered liver fat, thus making it a possible treatment for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is a growing health issue for humans. And then finally, their preliminary analysis indicated that wild rice had a positive influence on the microbiome. And so we may want to do some further research in this area. In just a minute, Lolly will talk about a little bit more about the protein study that we did. So hopefully we've enlightened you to consider wild rice, whether you're consumer planning meals or you're in the food industry thinking about your next value added product. Whether you choose hand harvested or cultivated, we hope you choose Minnesota. Lolly?
I'm going to, as Beth mentioned, I'm just going to provide a little bit more detail from the study related to the protein quality for the cultivated wild rice. And I have 2 charts here. And the first chart just shows the quantity of the protein in the grain or legume. And I've put the cultivated wild rice in comparison to some other grains and legumes for reference. And so I've circled the brown rice and the wild rice. Those are the actual data that came out of the study. And the other data on the chart is from literature. And I'm going to focus a little bit on the second chart, which is the quality of protein. And we refer to that as PDCAS. And that stands for protein digestibility corrected amino acid score. And the way that is derived is by measuring the digestibility of the protein and the amino acid score, and those two get multiplied together to come up with that PDCAS. The digestibility is something that's measured through rat feeding studies, as Beth mentioned, and it's a measure of how well the protein is both digested and absorbed. And the number is expressed as a percentage. And then the amino acid score is determined by analyzing the amino acids in the protein and assigning a value based on what's called the limiting amino acid. And so that's the essential amino acid that is the lowest in value compared to a reference. And that number is expressed from 0 to 1. And so as you can see on the chart, the cultivated wild rice compared well with other grains and legumes and plant sources of protein. The digestibility was actually 84%, which is good. And then as Beth had mentioned, the amino acid score was impacted by the fact that it is limiting in lysine. I think the score was about 0.72. And so when you multiply those together, you get a PDCAS value for the cultivated wild rice of about 0.6. And the fact that it's low, limiting in lysine is common for grains. It was the same, was true for the brown rice as well. And one way that you can sort of form a complete protein is if you were to pair the wild rice with a legume, because legumes are actually high enough in lysine, but they're limiting in methionine. And so by combining plant sources like that, you can create a complete protein. The next slide I have is just the same data, but I just wanted to highlight here that the way the protein source is processed can impact the PDCAS value. So I'm just highlighting it here with P. I put a pea protein isolate on the chart to show that the isolate is higher in that PDCAS value, and that's because the isolated protein is more bioavailable, and that makes that score go up. And so different kinds of processing or cooking methods can affect that PDCAS value, and it could impact it in both a negative or a positive way. So there's obviously more detail in the report that Beth referenced, and that report will be coming out soon. And I believe that we could send a copy of that to participants on the webinar if there's an interest. There's also more information there, as Beth referenced, about the impact on the microbiome. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Dan to handle the Q&A section.
All right, Lolly, thanks so much. And thank you also to Julie and Peter and Beth. And we'll take your questions through the Q&A portal on your screen. If you would put your questions there, that would be helpful. And Peter, we're going to start with you. We have a question just about growing wild rice, and a fertility question. They're asking you to talk a little more about what does it take to grow wild rice, and what are probably the fertilizer requirements and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, Dan. Wild rice production requires a fair amount of nitrogen. Phosphorus and potassium you have to be a little bit careful with, because in our flooded environment that can encourage algae growth. So in our rotation, we precede our wild rice with soybean production, which takes any excess P and K out of our system, and then it'll add the nitrogen back in. So primarily it's a nitrogen limiting factor, and our high organic soils, the micronutrients are primarily already there.
Are you adding anything through the process of growing it? Do you have to side dress or do any of that? Yeah,
we do a fall small amount of nitrogen in the fall in our rice on rice rotation. Then we'll fly on 2 fertilizer urea shots through an airplane just to spoon feed the crop as needed during the course of the season. When we do that, we also use our water containment system to close the system off so that we're not releasing any of that product out into the watershed.
And then how many pounds of rice can you expect for a good yield?
A really good yield would be about 1,000 pounds of finished product per acre.
And that's how you sell it?
Yes.
Okay. Julie, there's a question here about parboiling, and I believe that's partially cooking for consumers. And they're wondering if that impact on pre-cooking changes the nutrient value And they're wondering if it would be better for the consumer to get wild rice that's not pre-cooked and then do it themselves to get the best nutritional package out of the wild rice.
Just to clarify, parboil process is not a pre-cooking, it's a steaming. So what it's doing is it's aiding in gelatinizing the inner kernel before you dry it. So there is no pre-cooking, it's just steaming is what the parboiling does in the processing steps.
Okay. So there's no nutrients.
There's no nutrient change in the final product, no.
Okay. I'm going to ask you about piling it outside on the asphalt. Is it a pretty hardy? Does it get rained on? And
Yep, but it comes in at about a 32 to 35% moisture already. So it basically sheds the rain, the water.
all right. Is the seed held over from one crop to be planted the next year?
No, it's
Peter?
not. The short domestication history of the crop means that, like dandelions or any other weed, once you've reached maturity, the seed really wants to fall back off and reseed itself, as it would in the lakes, rivers, and in the region, which for us causes a couple of problems. One is bad weather can greatly impact our yield season to season. So we don't have to replant once the stand is established. However, because of that seed shattering and seed loss, I have no control over my stand density for the next year. And over the course of 3 or 4 or 5 years of continuous wild rice production, you get a strong genetic shift towards material that's going to shatter more and more. Our best genetics are getting hauled in and processed, and our worst genetics provides our seed base for the next year.
And that's why you want to get a good rotation.
Yep, and the seed can also lay dormant in the ground for even dry for several years. So we have to come out of wild rice production for 3 or 4 years to kill off that seed base, get reestablished with better genetics, and then depending on market conditions can go back in for 4 or 5 years.
Another question from a listener or a watcher today: would it benefit the producer more the green weight or the finished weight in Minnesota? Which would be the better way to sell your grain, green or finished? Don't you get that choice?
We do. We've done contracts a variety of different ways, even in my relatively short career. But there's lab tests that can give an estimate of what that finished product's going to be. So there's really no difference.
At what point is the grain at the point where it is the longest, where it has the longest shelf life or storage longevity? At what point? Not sure if I understand that question, but if somebody wants to, Julie or Pete.
On the finished rice, basically, wild rice has an unlimited shelf life as long as it's kept in dry, clean conditions. Basically, it's a 10% moisture and will last basically forever. On the finished.
Beth or Lolly, I wonder about the innovative ideas of using wild rice in other ways. Is there a lot of work going on and trying to create new recipes and new uses for a grain that has this much nutritional value?
You want to answer, Beth? Or I mean, from a food scientist's point of view, I would just say that there's definitely, it can be incorporated into different, like, for example, snack products or bars or things like that. You can get, wild rice maybe in a form that's more puffed, so it's actually ready to eat, and you can have it in a bar. But it certainly can be, as a whole food, it does have really good nutritional value. And so I think there's a wide range of uses in value-added food products.
From a food scientist standpoint, is it difficult to work with?
I mean, you have to, typically it kind of depends on the product. So I did some work when I used to work for a consulting company, and we were working on sort of a quicker cooking, salad concepts where we would use wild rice as one of the grains. And we just looked for wild rice that had some pre-cooking to it so that it did have a faster cooking time. So the lengthy cooking time can be a challenge, but there's other forms that are available that can help mitigate that.
Beth, did you want to weigh in on innovative ideas?
Yeah, I was just going to say that the bulk of wild rice market is actually in the ingredient and blend market already. So it is being used as an ingredient source in many food products.
Can you recommend a good directory to help identify or find naturally occurring lake rice and or cultivated rice suppliers around the state, around the country?
We have what we call marketer support program list. So if people would like that, they can contact the council and we can share that. And we do not have a good list of hand harvested wild rice. You can contact an individual reservation. The DNR might be of some help, but likely you're going to find more help by contacting the individual reservations.
How many wild rice farms are there in Minnesota? What is the average size of a wild rice farm? And are there other processors besides the Riviana?
There's just over 30 farms in the state of Minnesota, and I am not certain of the average size off the top of my head. I certainly have that data. Pete, do you have a guess at what our average size would be?
No, I don't. I think we're a little bit all over the board. It's a pretty unique crop, and because of the capital intensive nature, there's farms that have found a niche, I think, in a variety of sizes. So I would say that there is no average wild rice farm.
So my follow-up to Peter might be, you said you farm about 5,000 acres. How much of that in a year might be in wild rice?
We're equipped to be anywhere from maybe 1,700 to 2,700 acres in a given year. Most of that's dictated by market conditions.
Do any toxins from the asphalt leach into the wild rice while it's sitting on the lot?
No, it does not. We test the annual crop at the time of processing, and there is no toxin that is generated from the asphalt.
Is all of the rice grown to USDA certified organic standards, or just some of the farmers grow organic?
This time we only have one farm that is doing organic wild rice.
And if you want to import wild rice, if you want to import wild rice seed to my country, Pakistan, we have a listener from Pakistan today, as an introduction, what will be the procedure and who should I contact? So,
Julie, you probably know the most about that.
pardon?
You're talking about seed
Yes.
or rice?
That was a question. That they want to bring a seed into Pakistan. How do they get that process started?
So it's not finished rice, it would be seed, Beth.
If we're not talking about finished rice, there is no seed industry in the state of Minnesota, or I'm sorry, anywhere in the world, there is no wild rice industry. So as Peter mentioned, the farmers themselves grow out new varieties of seed and work with the council to sell that. We do not sell our seed outside of Minnesota. I suppose you could possibly go and gather some in the lakes. Maybe start on something like that, maybe with the DNR as the first point to even see what they would recommend and if they could point you in the direction of the regulatory hurdles you might need to cross if you're going to do that.
It's an unusual crop, that's for sure. Another question just about the seed and the species. Is wild rice one species? Is there seed varieties to choose from? And is there research being done on new and improved seed?
Yeah, the University of Minnesota has a breeding program that develops our varieties. What makes it a little bit unique is because there is no commercial seed industry. What tends to happen is the university will make an improvement that'll be integrated and adopted through the industry, and then that's the variety that will grow until the next improvement comes along. So rarely do you get competing varieties. And the system, because of the residual seed and the genetic shift that we already talked about, can't really handle multiple varieties at one time. We're working on that, but it's a difficult hurdle.
And the fact that you only have 30 farmers that need seed anyway. So yeah. Does cultivated wild rice nutritional value differ from wild growing rice?
Wild rice is the same genus and species, and the nutritional value is essentially the same.
Are any preservatives ever added to the rice prior to packaging?
No, there is no preservatives added to the wild rice prior to packaging.
Do improved genetics include GMOs introduced into the seed stock? I think you mentioned part of your presentation that there are no GMOs in wild rice, I think.
There is no genetically engineered wild rice anywhere in the world. So the breeding program that people might be thinking of in this case is a traditional breeding program, and no genetically engineered processes are even being considered.
To our viewer from Pakistan, we have a comment here that if you want to import, you should contact the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, and they could put you in touch with the right people. Also, does Riviana process organic rice?
Riviana does not process organic. We package it.
So when it comes in, it's already been processed?
Correct.
Here's a question about the University of Minnesota. Is a public land grant university, shouldn't the seed they develop be available to everyone? Maybe it's more of a comment than a question.
That's a question that's been asked a lot in every crop that I deal with. And what's happened over time is, as the land grant universities have been, funding has been cut back, public funding has been cut back over time, they've looked for ways to recoup that. And some of that is through licensing agreements and intellectual property. And it's fairly common at this point that that intellectual property is monetized in some way. So wild rice is similar to that.
Peter, the drastic reduction in the amount of seed grown, is that just that farmers are taking a path that's easier to navigate? They're just losing interest in growing wild rice? Or I think you showed us a slide where it had dropped off considerably since 2016.
Oh, yeah, that's all driven by market conditions. As one would expect, when you've got a relatively small industry that's as weather dependent as we are, production fluctuations move all over the place. And so the growers, when market prices are high, as of course we all would, we put in more acres, produce more, and drive prices down. We'll cut back, grow alternative crops for a few years. So that slide was really there to highlight that we have the capacity to grow more product. The market just isn't demanding it right now.
And that aligns with this next question. If you're doing research on more ways to use wild rice, is there a concern about the decrease in the amount of rice that's being cultivated over the past few years?
No, not only can we increase rotational acres that are in production, but we see a future in which the success of the breeding program will also improve production on a per acre basis.
Peter, what's the water footprint?
Some of the decline in that you saw on the chart that Peter put up also is driven, like you mentioned, by demand, and COVID certainly, like everything else, has played a role in demand over the last couple of years as well.
Certainly. What's the water footprint of wild rice that's cultivated, or is the research ongoing related to that?
We've tried to estimate that a variety of different ways. The Minnesota DNR and the watershed monitors the water that we do pump, and I keep track of every gallon that we take out of the system. What's hard is to estimate how much water is put back into the system. I would say in an average year, we're releasing all of what we've taken in because of rainfall adding to our closed system. In a year like last year, probably, we're putting it out into the field, so we're losing some to evaporation, but most years we're putting everything back that we're taking out.
And you do log it and monitor it?
Absolutely, and we report it to the DNR on an annual basis.
A constructed hybrid with wild rice would be a good idea and a good project. Somebody want to just make a comment there? Yeah. What's the average cost per pound of cultivated wild rice for the consumer? Does that fluctuate quite a bit?
The average cost per pound to the consumer?
Yes.
You range between $4.50 and $5.50 a pound.
And then one last question here. What are the largest wild rice growing regions in the US or the world?
The largest growing,
Minnesota has,
go ahead.
Minnesota has is the largest cultivated wild rice production anywhere in the world. Would be followed very, very closely by California. There is a little bit in Hungary, and that might be all right now. There was some in Australia, but that is no longer in production as far as I'm aware.
Very good. And I think we're going to leave it there today. Hopefully, people that have been participating today have learned a little bit about wild rice and the wild rice production. And I want to thank Julie and Peter, Beth, and Lolly for giving your time today and helping us with our webinar. That concludes AURI Connect's Webinar Wednesday for today. We do want to thank our presenters and our panelists. AURI Connect's Webinar Wednesday is presented by the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute of Minnesota. And AURI's mission is to foster long-term economic benefit for Minnesota through value-added agricultural products and processes. We're very interested in your feedback, so please respond when we send you any of our evaluations. Remember, for more information on today's program or any of the work that AURI is involved with, you can go to auri.org. And then be sure to join us again on March 9th when AURI Connects Webinar Wednesday spotlights AURI's partnership with USDA's Rural Cooperative Development Grant Program. Since 2010, AURI has received 8 USDA Rural Cooperative Development Grant, or RCDG grants, enhancing AURI's technical assistance through services to develop cooperatively and mutually owned businesses. You can join AURI's Webinar Wednesday, spotlight on AURI's partnership with USDA's Rural Cooperative Development Grant Program, March 9th at noon, to learn how this critical program utilizes cooperative development to positively impact rural economies. You'll learn about the program's successes, and you'll hear from cooperatives that have received services through this unique grant program. And you can always learn more about other work that AURI is involved with by going online to auri.org. We're looking forward to having you join us again on March 9th for another AURI Connects Webinar Wednesday.